I'll never forget, Austin. We're about 8 years in. Somebody came walking into my office one day and set down one of our packages that didn't look quite right. And he said, "No, man, it's a counterfeit. Take a look at it."
In today's episode, we're joined by Randy Hetrick, the former Navy SEAL and founder of the global fitness brand TRX. Stick around to hear Randy's hot take on what you must do in your first year of business to ensure you actually survive your own success.
Randy, what's your hot take for us today?
My hot take today is that most consumer businesses underinvest in IP.
So when you say IP, you mean like you're a direct-to-consumer company and you've got a unique product and you're just not worried about filing patents and protecting it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of tech companies, a lot of pharma companies, biomed companies, they get on their intellectual property because they kind of realize they're going to spend millions and millions and millions and millions and millions to develop the app or the drug.
Right.
If they haven't protected it, 5 ways from Sunday, that the Me Too's are going to come piling in and eat their lunch before they ever have a chance to recoup it. But consumer companies, consumer brands, very often don't spend the time to protect your designs, your inventions, your innovations, your brand early. Later on, it can be too late.
What was that journey like for you, for everyone listening, so they understand?
Well, I mean, I've been very, very, very fortunate with my attorneys. My early guy that I had said, "Look, we got to patent your invention," which was the suspension trainer, right? And his point early on was, if we don't get it now and you're successful, it's going to be too late. I was putting a significant amount of money into my patents, which ended up being one of the most important assets that we had when half of the shops in southern China decided that they wanted to suddenly start knocking off TRX suspension trainers.
How many years into the company were you when you filed the patents?
Oh, 2.
2 years.
Maybe one year, because you technically, you have to file your patents within a year of their first exposure.
You came up with the idea for TRX, you're selling out of backpacks, and then you stumbled upon a patent lawyer. Like, how did that happen?
I was about to start to sell the product. I had been introduced to a lawyer who was a relative, a cousin of a friend, and he happened to be a patent and trademark guy. I remember him asking me, like, "Do you plan to be successful?" I said, "What do you mean?" So, "Well, if you don't plan to be successful, you don't need any of this shit." At that point, I said, "Well, yeah, I plan to be successful." He said, "Well, then you need to protect your trademark of your company, trademark of your product, and the unique elements of your invention in the form of a patent." So I spent way more money than I had at the time to do that. And boy, was I thankful, a few years later when our sales took off. I'll never forget, Austin. We were about 8 years in when somebody came walking into my office one day and set down one of our packages that didn't look quite right. And I was like, "Wait a minute, it's ours, but something looks off. The printing is a little duller." And he brought it in and set it down and said, "It's a counterfeit." I said, "Counterfeit? That's what happens to Louis Vuitton and, Gucci, not to TRX." And as I opened it up and started holding it in my hand, I was like, "Wait, it's way too light and flimsy. And the picture, the graphics are printed on a cheap printer." And sure enough, and then it just exploded. And the number of counterfeit products, there was a point at which we were the single most counterfeited product on Amazon.com.
How many years in did you experience the first counterfeit?
About 8 years later.
Okay.
And it was as our sales were really inflecting. Nobody wants to copy you until they're sure this product is a hit.
Yeah. You had to file a patent within the first year. That's the rule of the invention. Then another 7 years later, some people started to knock you off. Then you went to war. Is that when you started? Year 8?
Well, what happened was that the counterfeits had proliferated, right? And Amazon, I mean, you got to go back right a while. Remember, this was not all that long after Amazon switched over from selling only books. So as Amazon was exploding as the platform of e-commerce, right, it truly was the Wild West back then. It's not anymore. Amazon does a much, much better job now, in part because of our relationship and what they...
Yeah, I know you were big in that.
We ended up having to bring a case against an American company because, if you sued someone, a Chinese company, the odds of winning the case in China were 0. Right. And that if you won a case in the US, you're unable to enforce. So we picked one of the main infringers that was an American company, and we brought suit against them. And that suit, dude, took 3 years and about $2.5 million. At the time, I remember my board was really dubious about the amount of money that
you were spending on the suit, right?
Yeah, on the suit. And I can't blame them. And we knew that if we won, the guys that we'd sue were just going to turtle over and go bankrupt. But that wasn't the point. The point wasn't what we were going to collect from them. It was that Amazon had agreed if we won this case, that they would then take it and they would enforce, across their platform and basically clear all of the.
And they did, right? They enforced it.
And they did.
Right.
And so for us, it ended up being hugely valuable and hugely worthwhile in terms of ROI over the course of the next 10 years, 15 years now. Had we not brought the suit, had we not had the IP and not been able to bring it, I think we probably would have died because the proliferation of knockoffs was just so massive that, first of all, it confuses the market. Second of all, even if the market is looking at you, you got all these cheap comparatives that are out there.
Yeah.
And it pushes your price down to the point at which, you don't have enough margin to survive.
One thing that's interesting here is that the ROI was obviously huge, but it's a risk. And so every entrepreneur has to do that risk reward. How did the patent infringement affect your retail wholesale? Were any of them trying to go to the gyms?
Yeah, well, they were. And equally important, the cheap knockoffs aren't safe. If you own kinds of products, right, it can actually involve health. And so initially when we had counterfeits, that was a terrible issue, right? We had these, it was mostly overseas, but it was also in the US that these cheap Chinese knockoffs would break. And, it looked like it was one of ours, except fortunately for us, part of our protection plan was to have individual serial numbers on every one of our products. When one broke, we would go through an authentication process and ultimately show that it wasn't ours.
So it created this weird liability for you too, right? Because like a knockoff goes, says it's TRX, it breaks, and then you got to prove, that really isn't us.
There was a lot of brand risk. And I think that that's another thing that consumer companies need to think about in protecting your brand is that if you're not protecting it, then the customer may rightly assume that the thing that they bought that fell apart was your responsibility.
Your thing.
As a customer. And you end up with the problem with if you have resellers. Now they're in the mix, right? And so suddenly you have quality issues popping up that you can't attribute because it's not in your supply chain. You know that. And yet there are product returns being reported relating to your brand. And so it's a little bit of a death by 1,000 cuts kind of a risk if you're not aggressive about protecting your turf.
They always say as an entrepreneur, your number one goal is to survive, right? And so that's kind of it. I mean, you've talked about that before. That was what you had to do, survive. And without the patent, you don't think you would have survived.
No, and I think for a lot of consumer brands, your trademark may be your most important piece of IP.
Right.
So, protecting it, protecting the use of it, making sure that you're in control of your brand's destiny. It's really, really important.
Well, thanks for joining, Randy. I'm sure a lot of, folks that will listen to this will learn and hopefully prepare.
Hey man, it's a pleasure to be with you. I love my pal Austin. Love Northbeam. What an incredible company you've built, brother. I take my hat off, but I already got it off. So
love you too, brother. So proud of you. All right, cool.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want more marketing hot takes, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to avoid missing any future videos.